So the big question is, do you need, as a clinician, to explain to your patients that you are using AI? And B, there's the black box effect and explainability. How much disclosure goes to the patient about how a clinician has come up with a diagnosis, a prognosis, and a treatment plan? Do you really have autonomy as a patient if all of that is not described to you?
Hello, and welcome to AI and Healthcare. I'm Mika Newton, your host, and I'm here with Dr. Colleen Lyons. And one of the most exciting things about this conversation is I think that Colleen brings a very new and probably contrarian view to everything we've been talking about in AI and healthcare. So without stealing your thunder, Colleen, tell us about your viewpoints here.
All right. Thank you. And thank you for having me on and giving me this platform. I have been thinking about AI ethics for some time, both as a professor of clinical research ethics and also as an employee at the FDA. By the way, I'm at the FDA. I am representing only myself and no other organization. And I started to think about the ethical implications of AI. As I studied the issue more, I realized that there was a whole lot of chatter around ethical AI, trustworthy AI, responsible AI. And then when I began to start to write and think about this, I realized that when you look underneath the really pretty PowerPoints that are developed by consultants, there's nothing underneath them except for a few rare occurrences. So that has become my project, my passion project, is to really understand how we can truly have trustworthy, responsible, ethical AI to meet the needs of the business and the organization, and to do it in such a way that an organization will sustain through the AI froth that we're in, and not only get through this, but also flourish in the end, because values are what you're able to hang your hat on.
So, one of the things we touched on briefly was the Belmont report. Can you help us understand the Belmont report? And in particular, how does it relate to AI ethics in healthcare specifically?
Sure. Well, I'm a bioethicist and a business ethicist. So one of the seminal document in bioethics in America, which is different from the rest of the world, are three things. The first one is autonomy, that each of us has the right to decide what it is that we want done in terms of a medical procedure, for example. It also involves being a subject in a clinical research trial. The second point is, the fancy Greek words are beneficence and non-maleficence. It's do good and minimize harm, and it's really related to the Hippocratic Oath. The last thing is justice. And what that means at the time that it was written, and I'll talk a bit more about that, justice is that vulnerable populations are not used as clinical trial guinea pigs just because they're in a prison, or they're a child, or they have a lower intellectual capacity, or they are in a Nazi camp. So those are these are the jewels of bioethics, and they are still very prominent today. It's extremely important to talk about why the Belmont report was written, because it translates into the environment that we are in today with AI and the asymmetrical power situation that we have, because AI can have a whole lot more power than you or me or any physician. A couple of things had happened leading up to it. The first one was the initial reason was Tuskegee. I'm not sure if you are familiar with Tuskegee. A lot of people are. The essence of it is, after World War I, a lot of our soldiers came back from Europe, and there were tons of cases of syphilis. So the federal government realized, we're probably going to have another world war. Let's figure out how this disease progresses so that we can treat it. Well, unbeknownst to very poor Black sharecroppers in Alabama, they were enrolled in a clinical trial to show the progression of syphilis. They were A, not told that they were in a clinical trial. B, they were not told that they were actually being injected with live syphilis virus. And C, it was really cynical, because these poor people would go and they were offered a hot meal. So these men would go home to their wives have syphilis, not know it, et cetera, et cetera. So an absolute ethical debacle and failure. In addition to that, we had the Nuremberg trials and the Nazi doctor trials, man's inhumanity to man. That was going on. And then there was a third piece. There was this Harvard doctor, Henry Beecher, who in the mid-'60s wrote this article about clinical research trials that were being conducted by his peers, a very close group. Doctors do not drop a dime on other doctors. And he wrote about 22 different studies of how vulnerable populations were being used in clinical research. And that really broke everything open. As a result of those things, we have the Belmont report today, and it's still standing 50, 60 years later. So how does that translate into AI today? So those principles, autonomy. Let's talk about informed consent. Mm-hmm. So one of the issues related to AI is there's the machine on the team with physicians. So there's been a lot of talk about the fact that particularly in radiology, AI is giving a really precise diagnosis in terms of imaging for radiology. So radiologists use AI. Do they need to determine what their diagnosis is? Do they need to disclose that they're using AI? And there's a myriad of ways in which AI is now on the clinical care team for patient care. So the big question is, beyond radiology, do you need, as a clinician, to explain to your patients that you are using AI? A. And B, there's the black box effect and explainability. That's one of the Achilles heels of AI is this unexplainability or inexplainability, I should say. So how much disclosure goes to the patient about how a clinician has come up with a diagnosis, a prognosis, and a treatment plan? So right there, autonomy. Do you really have autonomy as a patient if all of that is not described to you?
So it's interesting. Let me ask you a couple of questions as you're talking, just coming to mind. Number one, when we think about AI versus, let's say, predictive analytics, because we've used predictive analytics to do all sorts of things in medicine. I think going all the way back to family history, I always think of like, what's the most basic form of like prediction or risk factoring that you do? And it's like, well, what did all of your family get or die from, et cetera? And by the way, if everybody died of heart disease or everybody died of cancer, seems like a good idea that you should focus on those areas, right? I don't think there's any argument around that, but much of that was then validated in data, right? And then there are different different algorithms and rules that came out of that. And all of that now is pretty automated, I think, into the back ends of things. So how is, I guess, first question, like, how do you view the line between like predictive tools, risk-based tools, and then AI, which is in some ways also doing these things of looking for factors that are in there that might indicate going one way or another? And then how much explainability, right? This is the other thing I struggle with, on explainability, do you get? Because I always then think of the kind of the opposite spectrum of complexity. Let's take a CT scan, right? I don't understand the math that goes into interpreting, the electrical signals that come off a CT, right, or an MRI machine, or so on or so forth. And it makes these images and pictures that, frankly, are probably even not intuitive for many other people to necessarily read. So there's a huge amount of interpretation, right, of like basic physics. It's a little bit like, do I really need to know what happens when I turn on my car? I mean, I know, but do I really know? And how much of that needs to be explained to me about which type of piece it is? So sorry, like two questions, like where does AI start? And then where do you think this explainability thing really gets us?
I'll start with the explainability thing, because if you're a meat eater and someone gives you a beautiful piece of meat and it's delicious, sometimes it's not a good thing to ask, what is this? It's like, what's in that sausage? You do not want to know, but it is delicious. The explainability piece is a cousin to the transparency piece. So I'm advocating strongly for saying the transparency piece, which is we don't understand how this happened. And how I know that one of my children have been really, really ill. Prognosis was BAD. And 6'2", gorgeous professional guy right now, who's my darling son. And the neurologist had no reason for why he was better. So that's my N of one. And it's also, if you can absolutely expand that, eureka. Sometimes we don't know why things happen. The point is, in the transparency piece, which I think actually enhances trust, is when a physician has a really tight way of explaining to the patient population, assuming there's no education and maybe English as a second language, that they're able to explain to them, hey, I have this tool and it looks good. I'm not sure why, because we don't know that yet. Our ability to catch up with the technology, there's always a gap. And here are your choices. Maybe you have a prognosis or a treatment plan that doesn't use the AI piece because there's a person saying, I'm just too uncomfortable. So I think that the transparency piece is more important at this point than the explainability piece. So would you like to have more?
I get it. I'm actually picturing this very specific scenario because it leads back to the predictive algorithm. So I know a company, without getting into their names here, and they develop AI, not for radiography imaging, but they develop AI for assisting physicians who are doing colonoscopies, right? And it's real-time image processing during the colonoscopy that highlights areas in the camera and acts like a second set of eyes for the GI doc that just says, hey, that thing over there, you should go take a closer look at that. I think it's X, or I think it's Y. I think it's X, or I think it's Y. And it uses some pretty complex image processing, if you can imagine, in just automatically coding what that is and trying to draw someone's attention to it where they might miss something. I mean, you can imagine someone's doing colonoscopies all day. Not the job I want, but I guess it's everyone. But they might miss things, they might get tired, they might not identify something correctly. And so explaining how that works and that it's happening, is that really an issue?
I like that distinction because it is different. That's a very different discussion than you've been diagnosed with colon cancer, for example, right. and here's what your prognosis is, here's what the treatment plan is, or here are your options. How can I help you with that? In the surgical suite, that is such a precise and specific expertise that to explain the detail of what you just described to a lay person, I think that's burdensome. It's more of, we now have robotic surgical technology that actually gives me another set of eyes, gives the surgical team another set of eyes, and I will be using that. That is not negotiable. You know why? Because that's a standard of care. So I love the distinction between the two because I hadn't really thought about that before.
So you really then focus here on things like diagnosis. So the AI says you have this diagnosis and recommends these potential set of treatment options, right? And we've done a fair amount of work. We did work in advanced metastatic cancer patients on what are the possible things you could even think about trying, right, when someone's really, really sick. And so it's how did those decisions get made, and what are if I'm understanding the kind of the transparency, what are the factors that drive that? What data was it trained on? Is that where your concern lies?
Yes, it is. And so you asked earlier about predictive AI and also the designation of a hereditary genetic issue that one may have. So those are two different issues. One very AI related and the other is more values related. So from the predictive perspective, the issue there is that our databases are extraordinarily biased. And that's not a DEI claim. This is that if you look at the demographics that go into research subjects and the databases that provide us our medicine, they are very skewed. They are very skewed. And do a plug here for the opportunity for AI in clinical research trials, because I think we really have a true ability to level the field and have all manner of population represented in clinical research trials through things like digital twinning. And that's going to up the game in terms of equity and access, and then actually reduce costs in healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. This isn't the play for that, but I wanted to mention that as a top 3 thing that I want to see happen. But if those predictive algorithms are using faulty data, then there are going to be a misdiagnosis or a misprognosis based on the demographic of that particular person. So I'll use an example. It isn't medical, because there are medical examples, but I'm still uncomfortable mentioning medical terms. I didn't go to medical school, but when you go into, you may have heard of this, when you go into a public restroom, you put your hand underneath the soap dispenser, and what happens?
Soap
comes out. If you have dark skin, it doesn't. Or it did it before the problem was identified. So a person of color goes to wash their hands, there's no soap. Everybody else is getting it, and they go down to the next one where I just use a sheet. Why isn't it working? Well, the refractories were calculated for a person with white hands. So then, was that a biased algorithm? No, the algorithm is neutral. The data scientists were biased unconsciously. So I think that we are going to start to address the bias in data sets by, it's going to be incremental and situational. But in any event, right now, the way those data sets are constructed, I think that predictive is really valuable as part of a whole conversation around here's some of the drawbacks and informed consent and autonomy. What do you think is the best for you? Here's my point of view as a subject matter expert, as a doctor.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always think about bias as like, it's everywhere. Everything is biased. So there's no unbiased thing. But bias is actually good in certain scenarios, right? Meaning when it is biased in the favor of the particular situation, right? Or the sub-participant, right? Or the patient, right? And the data has been biased to make the algorithm more powerful for that particular type of patient. That's actually what you want. You don't want it not biased or a general purpose algorithm, because you're trying to deliver individual care, right? We're trying to help a clinician often in the treatment of a specific patient. And so having a really high level of confidence in the predictive values for particular scenarios and being able to explain what those are, I think, versus just the overall general thing of how biased or unbiased it is, feels like a really important difference between, because everything in my mind becomes biased at some point in this.
Yeah.
Dialogue.
Yep. Depending on what seat you're sitting in.
So when we think about transparency, and I think part of the point you were making is we're thinking back to the Belmont report, is people need to understand how AI is impacting them in healthcare. And part of what I heard you say is that there is no rules for disclosure, right? Because otherwise we would have that. Is that something that we're missing? Is there a protocol for the use of AI that's missing or being developed, or that you think is needed? Am I tracking?
Yes. Yeah, you absolutely are. So yes, it is needed. And right now, just think of, a speckled hen has dots all over it. And so there are isolated islands of some kind of either government regulation, which in the U.S. is really skinny, or there are institutional governance standards, which are more rigorous. So it's very much in play, and we absolutely need it. The Solomon's decision, do you cut the baby? No, you don't. You try and walk away from that. In terms of balancing innovation against risk, is going to be understanding where those risks are and where the regulations are, so that we can make sure that we are getting the very best of AI in healthcare, and then also minimize the risks that are associated with those.
So I love this, because I think it leads us into, will AI repeat the kind of dot-com boost-bust cycle? Will companies survive this? And I actually wrote a piece about regulation versus deregulation, like the pros and cons of regulation versus deregulation. So in highly deregulated markets, you can move very quickly often. right? And there's less what I would call regulatory capture by the incumbent players in the market, right? Which often happens in highly regulated markets, right? Where the
Oh,
innovation is
interesting.
essentially stifled because the large players lock you out. And in order to be successful or prove you're doing it, it just takes there's too much red tape, right? So you can't get through on the other side. And there's, a safety aspect to regulation, right? And governance, right? To ensure the do no harm piece. But then there's also just an innovation killer in like making too many rules so that people, don't innovate and they can't break through right into the marketplace. So, and I think that affected the .coms, right? And many actually technology companies as they try to grow up. And I think it's why we have very large incumbent players now, and particularly in certain technology spaces that are almost impossible to displace.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So the .com boom and bust, which I see parallels definitely to the boom, and my prediction, and don't need a big fat crystal ball. That bust is coming to a neighborhood near you, which is part of why we need to get ahead of it and maturely address it. The .com boom was the result of out of control PEs, no profit, but stock price out of insane, a notion of get in and get out in terms of IPOs and VC capital, very toxic environments that are very well documented. Certainly the FOMO, fear of missing out, everybody wanted to be in. And if you had a dog and you named it .com, you were able to get a couple $1 million and set up a foosball table. And then that folly ended up being a $5 trillion market cap crash. $5 trillion in 2002. So that's quite a bit. That's quite a bit. And at that same time, we also had, it was a zeitgeist going on. We also had Enron and WorldCom. So these are these like the Wild West. The guardrails went out the window in terms of this magical thing. Lay people were becoming enamored with the stock price, with the stock market vis-a-vis these technologies. And as a result of the Enron really is the thing that tipped it over, and then the .com bust, something called Sarbanes-Oxley came into place, which it's a very compliance-driven. And I've been in organizations. I've been a senior ethics advisor, looking at how these things play out. It becomes a check-the-box compliance thing, and we see what happened: the bank failure of 27, and then we see what's happening now with AI. So the regulation can do so much, only so much, and we need it. And it needs to be really thoughtful, and all of the stakeholders need to be at the table and really be listened to. The other thing is, if an organization is only relying on, we check the box, it's legal, isn't it? They are not going to survive. I really don't think that they are going to survive. So that's why the values piece of an organization is necessary to complement what the regulation is. Because otherwise it's one hand clapping. Compliance doesn't work.
Yeah, it's interesting. You think a lot of deregulation leads to lots of hype, right? Lots of people developing technology. And then we have a backlash against that, often with pretty large scale, I would say thoughtful in the sense that there's best intentions, right, behind the type of regulation that gets put in place. But it tends to just be foisted on everybody kind of legally. And to your point, you then get, a bunch of regulation. I mean, look at the number of people now who continue to run what we would call private companies versus public companies because of just the sheer amount of compliance you would have to go through to be a public company. And say, forget it. It's just not worth it. We're going to keep this whole thing private, and, it creates all sorts of liquidity issues. One of the things we've seen here, I think, in the AI and healthcare market, which I think has been interesting, is there's been a lot of hype around AI and how the promise it could impact in healthcare. But I don't know that we've seen that much implementation yet, like the actual real valuable things. And we talk about, and I know you think about values, right, in terms of the ethical piece. I also kind of get down to what's the core value of like, what does this technology actually do? Is it saving someone's life? Is it saving money? Is it giving people more time back in the day? Because, if it doesn't do something valuable, right, that has an impact, then it's not really worth anything, and we shouldn't be spending any time on it, which is different than the hype cycle. Right. So how should we think about, like, when you talk about values and companies being around, I just think, the word value can mean lots of things. How do you view that
You
perspective?
can, yeah. So the value piece is when an organization, and this is, I'm walking you through my model now.
Mhm.
Um, so I, and this is, I developed I haven't named it yet. I want to call it sturdy leadership, but I'm not sure because that's actually what it is. Um, we talked about this a little bit. We are in what's called a VUCA environment:
Mhm.
volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And this was developed by the Army War College after in the 80s, after the Berlin Wall fell, because there was a white hat, the U.S. and our allies, and black hat, Soviet Union, and that all went out the window when the wall fell. And we have, insurgent combatants that don't have a flag. So does the Geneva Convention apply to them?
Mhm.
Just and a million different doctrine types of questions to be asked. And that term VUCA was coined. And then it really started getting into the leadership literature. And now in the AI literature, I'm talking tens of thousands of peer-reviewed articles,
Mhm.
not tens of, like almost 20,000 in the past couple of years, incorporating VUCA into leadership models and AI and bioethics, by the way. And so it's really becoming part of the parlance because there's no better way to describe the arena that we are in. I've added chaos as another C. So volatile, uncertain, complex, chaotic, and ambiguous. And if you talk to anybody who has a pulse or their company has a pulse and wants to live another day, they acknowledge that that's the environment that they're in.
Mhm.
So given that they're in that environment, they have to change. Second leg of the stool is that change management initiatives, which I think AI is first a change management initiative and second, a technology play. Because when's the last time you got all excited about .com? That you even heard any hype around it?
Mm.
It's gone. We don't talk about it. I say by 2030, we are not going to be talking about AI. We're going to be talking about AI's grandson. It's going to be gone. So we are repeating this, getting into the froth. By the way, 70% of change management initiatives fail. This is per McKinsey,
Mhm.
who's involved in a very high percentage of significant change management initiatives. And they fail for the following reasons. The same reason there was a .com failure. Management doesn't walk the talk. There's not enough resources. There's so much change that employees have change fatigue and they won't do it. And there's a lot of this. They're doing this and saying, no way am I doing that. The
Mhm.
same thing's happening now and people don't have a voice. So there are organizations that are either developing, deploying, or implementing AI. And there are people in those organizations who are thinking, this isn't going to work. And they are unable, they don't have the competency to speak up.
Mhm.
Now, this goes back to values, the reason why I gave all of that. The anchoring keystone for organizations is to understand what their values are and to do it in, I call it a bespoke manner. The values that are going to work for xCures is not going to work for Pfizer.
Mhm.
They're different. You have different missions. So your values democratized, meaning that everyone in your organization, and you can use AI for this, has an input on what is most valuable to them as a person. Because when you have that moment when you are to speak up, you want to speak up because you know it's wrong, but you are afraid to because of the consequences. And we're going to talk about xCures in a bit because I want you to share what you shared with me. If people either are afraid to speak up because they will lose their job or be marginalized, or they think that the pain of speaking up will be greater than not speaking up, we have to change that equation and create an environment in which people can embody their values. You democratize them, and that's what gets socialized as our values. So when or somebody within an organization says, you know what, what we're working on now really isn't patient-centered. We are focused on the balance sheet right now to the exclusion of patients. So to have a conversation about it, how do you normalize that conversation around values and give people the competency to speak up? It is the most required thing. Oh, speak up when you say something, and the least skilled. So that goes with the values. So those are how those things tie together. You have your identified values. You teach people actually how to speak up, and you operationalize those values by using things like implementation science. Why in God's name do we look at values or ethics as something that's other than, and it's a once a year event when you sign the code of conduct? So these need to be embedded so that the values become alive.
Don't values really become, I always think of it as like, what's the culture, right? So I always think of culture as kind of the assembly, or it's the representation of the values. And people say like, oh, we have this kind of culture, that sort of culture. I'm not sure it's always easy to describe culture. I've been in lots of different organizations, and I can give you what my perception was of it. But I also know from talking to colleagues, they actually had different perceptions sometimes of the same culture and value systems that were in place. And I would have to say most of the time, honestly, they didn't match any sort of guideline or website rhetoric, right? That was, what some boardroom or the board of directors decided the company's values were. And then there was what everybody was doing, right? And the culture that they were behaving in. And that was quite different. Actually, something I spent a lot of time thinking about is like how to instill a central culture and community, right? In virtual technology organizations, right? And how do you do that so that it actually sticks and makes a difference, right? And it isn't just, individual atoms of people flying around doing random things. So, it's interesting. You brought up the internet and how we wouldn't be talking, we don't talk about the .com anymore. And there's a topic here that I think is really interesting in healthcare around data, which is, I care a lot about. But when I think about what happened with the internet, when the internet happened, nobody really knew what to do with it. So even in the .com boom, if you look at what happened is people started trying to figure out how to build a business around the internet. And most of them failed. And most of them were frankly businesses that didn't need to exist, or they would have been very successful. But if you look at who really, like what stuck with us with the internet, it's really e-commerce. Now, there's some other things that have stuck around, but e-commerce took what was essentially already taking place, which were transactions between individual places, right? So you'd have, we had banking by electronic. You just called your bank with the computer, right? The computers talked to each other, but it was not a general sort of network effect, but it was a point-to-point connectivity issue. And the internet suddenly created an opportunity to create marketplaces where you had protocols and network effects, right, that allowed you to actually aggregate. So now what happens, I don't shop for anything anymore that can be brought to my front door. And I talk to an AI, right, that I tell to order stuff for me, right? And it shows up. And so we don't talk about it anymore, but it's still very much here. Are we going to see that with AI and healthcare? Is it just going to be assumed that people are using these algorithms, right? And if you're not using these algorithms, right, you're actually on the other side of the coin. Like it would be unethical not to use, right? So it's like a flip, right? Some point is like, hey, you got to be transparent, you use everyone. And then there's like, hey, if you don't use this, you're actually now doing harm. So where does that flip over happen where it goes from like, be careful to like, oh no, if you don't, you're in trouble.
You're in trouble. Actually, I just want to highlight a point and kind of close that an earlier question that you asked. So it was B2B, business to business, that really enabled, that really socialized the internet as a way to actually make money. So that meant that companies actually tied their balance sheet and their reporting to Wall Street based on their ability to do work and transact on the internet. It was a value add. We are at the point now, and it's one of the really important points, and it goes back to the FOMO, fear of missing out. Companies are, I think it's more on the deploying and implementation side, AI, because they feel like they have to do it. And the scenario you just laid out is exactly one of the places I wanted to go in this, because one of the quandaries that physicians have right now is, as I mentioned earlier, there's a machine on the team. AI is actually part of the care team for patients. So we have to figure out how to make room for that additional third party in the room and do it in such a way that it adheres to the principles of the Belmont report and the principles of the healthcare institution, and figure out a way to incorporate that, so that we are leveraging the technology that's there. Now, one of the quandaries that a physician has is, geez, that tumor board, usually if there was a cancer diagnosis, you'd go to the tumor board. It would be, you'd say, okay, we all have everything. I'm going to close my binder, off we go. This is what I'm going to do. And now AI will give you that same analysis. We've already recognized as probably faulty data. Let's assume it's faulty data. But they're going to give a recommendation. So now the provider's thinking, am I going to be held liable if there's an adverse event because I used AI, if it turns out that because it's not explainable how AI came up with that, am I going to be held liable in a peer review, or by the same token, is a physician going to be held liable for an adverse event when that AI had a different prognosis and treatment care? So I've thought about this, and I'm thinking that actually when these things start going to court, and they will, a really good defense is when you have a CEO and a leadership team that says, we identified our values, we democratized them, we operationalized them, we taught people how to speak up. And yes, there was an adverse event, whether the physician used AI or didn't, whatever the case may be. I think judges and juries are going to be a lot more lenient on an organization that in good faith did the right thing and were patient-centric. And we need to understand that we are in a huge ambiguity right now. And that's, to me, I would, if I were a CEO of a healthcare concern, I would absolutely be doing the values thing. Even if I looked at it like, oh my gosh, this is such a waste of time, you have to come in with a defensive posture right now.
It's interesting. I've talked with a number of folks, and I guess this kind of leads in the question, when is it ethically important to use AI in healthcare? Like, when is it important to do that? So I think one of the problems we have is like, where does the liability lie, right? So if you are using a technology, right, and you are a licensed physician or nurse or healthcare, there are lots of types of HCP out there, right? And you use that AI, and then you are still treating the patient, you're the insured licensed person, aren't you still responsible? And I agree with you. I think it's only a matter of time where someone says, yes, but this tool that I was given and used told me to do this thing that ended up being wrong for whatever reason, or at least is suspected of being wrong. And then the question becomes like, is it the institution that implemented that tool whose job it was to actually vet the tools and make sure that they meet their criteria? Was it the manufacturer, right, of the tool who did or didn't have the training data? And I think it's going to be really tricky to tease all of that apart. But, as I think we know, it'll follow the money in many ways, I suspect, as to like who will be able to provide compensation or remuneration for whatever damage was done. And they will, I think, end up, eventually being the ones who are held responsible because they're the ones who had the most to gain and lose from the matter. So I guess, how do we think about that? Like, is it just too risky, or is there this kind of, again, going back to the tip over point, I think there's certain cases where if you're not using it right now, you might actually end up in the reverse of that problem, where it isn't that the tool was wrong. Someone might come back and say, you should have had access to this tool, or you should have used these tools on my images and my data because you would have found this thing and you just chose not to do it. And the guys up the street were doing it, and I would have been fine if I was there, but now I'm not.
Exactly. And let's take that one step further in the sort of, where alternative truth world that we're in, people just take their stories and run with it. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and you're absolutely right. Right now, there are no clear-cut answers. And if someone thinks they have it, they haven't thought enough about it. So I always look outside or look at other areas for guidance. So one of the things that came to mind was the supply chain. So a company like Boeing or any automotive, huge supply chains, like 10,000 players in it. So a corporation is responsible for the ethical behavior of those suppliers in the supply chain. So if you have a supplier who also happens to be engaging in human trafficking, you need to know that. And if it turns out that there's liability, you are responsible for it. So I've been starting to think about where can we borrow from to sort of catch up with the complexity, because these are like matrices on 3D. There's so many data points, and there's only so much that we can do in our human capacity, but AI is going to help us if we do it the right way. So that's what I've started to think about. So right now, and I was thinking about this very point, within let's say a large healthcare system, the responsibility of the CEO and the board is to make sure that all employees are trained appropriately on AI and what it is. They are trained on the ability to speak up. They're given the competency to speak up. And these things are tied to the values of the organization, that hopefully one of those values is patient-centric care. And so if you have those things and you have an adverse event, which you will have, what position were you in? If you didn't do the things that I just talked about or we've been talking about, I think you're going to be standing there in the cold with your shirt off, and it's snowing. And that's the onus is on us, not only to return value to shareholders. I'm never forgetting that. This is not an either or proposition. You need to make money. Please go make money. I believe in ethical capitalism, but do it in such a way where you are embracing the technology and you're also understanding how to mitigate that risk and letting it, don't always worry about where that edge is. The edge will find you. You don't have to go look for it. Just make sure that you're in the middle and you're sturdy in your approach, and give your physicians the level of comfort that you will be with them. We're talking about intelligent failure here. And the intelligent failure is, based on what I understand, this is a good AI tool developed by people with good intent and skill. And this is what the diagnosis is. And this is what the treatment plan is. And if there's really an issue, if it's like it goes from, I'm not sure, to this hits my gut, you stop. And you go get your tumor board together, or you get your colleagues together and you engage. Now, hopefully that's on it's a bell curve. That's not that many that are going to do that. But then you know when to stop, and that the pressure isn't so much from a profitability perspective or the insurance. We didn't even talk about that. The insurance pressures, that you have some kind of you have a reliability for those who are involved in the kind of the supply chain of delivering healthcare.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think about this complexity, and I think you're absolutely right, by the way. People who are not thinking about values and their approach and the change management required, right, in order to do this at the leadership and executive level are setting themselves up for a very difficult position. And I think it comes from the fact that you can't ignore this. There's an inevitability to the application of technology. One of the things I talk about a lot is we are so resource constrained, in particular in the healthcare space, based on the demand, right? And our ability to supply quality healthcare is just doesn't, we don't have enough doctors. We don't have enough nurses. We don't have enough hospitals. There's just not enough resources. So we have to solve this technological problem, right, in order to deliver care. And if we're going to solve the efficiency, right, financial complication of the healthcare system, which takes you all the way out to the payers, right, and who's paying for what and what are we covering or not, we should be able to do that and get a higher, better set of outcomes for everybody involved too, because we certainly ethically can't say, great, we can deliver healthcare for everyone cheaply, and it's really bad, right? Like you can't go revert. So I think we're just in a very interesting time where we are compelled to apply this type of technology. And I think the people who understand that fact and follow the types of practices that you're describing are the ones who are going to be successful at it, right? And the ones who don't follow those types of frameworks, or who just kind of let it happen to them based on vendor selection criteria, right, are going to be in just a world of hurt, because not only is it going to impact their quality of care, right, and the relationships that they have with their population that they're serving, but they're going to end up, I think to your point, in financial distress in one way or another.
Yeah. I'm going to flip the script and ask you a couple of questions. Sure. So based on what we just talked about, we talked about a values-driven organization in the healthcare space. And your organization is intriguing to me in terms of not only the product that you bring to market, which is, I've seen a testimonial or two, and it's very emotional, actually, in terms of what you do. So, what is the ethical imperative for your type of product delivery, or what you do in the marketplace? And then I'm going to follow up with another question about your organization internally.
Yeah. So when I think about what is our mission and what do we set out to do, and we've been in business for about 7 years now. This is year 7 of our endeavor. And what is it that we set out to do? And we set out and continue to advance the idea that there's been a lot of talk about learning health systems, which are learning to generate better outcomes for patients and individuals. But honestly, there's been very few examples of learning health systems. This is not a new idea. It's been around for a very long time, right? And it's a very obvious idea to everyone that if we're going to do things, we should learn from all the things we do and try to get better all the time. So when we think about that, we think about outcomes for patients and putting patients in care, actually clinical care, first and foremost, for achieving, we want our products and our company to contribute to increases in care. And the way we do that is through scientific accuracy, validation, right, reproducibility, transparency on our tools and technology. And again, it drives itself all the way down to the technology. Why? Because we're a technology company, and putting aside our values, our go-to-market, right, is to produce tools and technologies that then enable people to deliver on that better care. I want to say, interestingly, we did a lot of work around clinical decision-making early on and in providing information. But to this day, the single biggest challenge that we see, and the one that we're trying most to address, is actually access to information. So information retrieval, right, which is the flip side of putting more data into the system, is actually getting the data that's right out, right, quickly and easily, is a very difficult and ongoing problem, I think, for everybody. And so that's ended up being our kind of now almost sole focus, at least in the short term.
Well, that's from what I can tell, and I have no idea who your competitors are or anything like that, but this type of tool that puts knowledge. So data is data. It means nothing unless you're able to translate it into actionable knowledge, and it puts that data in the hands of the patient and their advocates, and which helps inform the care team. So as you said, everybody wins. So I've been thinking there is actually an ethical imperative, and perhaps at one point there'll be a regulatory or legal imperative to have these types of tools available, because the government will be spending less money or have better outcomes. The second thing I wanted to ask you about was, we're talking about values a lot. Tell me about the values at xCures. How do they breathe? How are they exercised and used?
Oh, that's a great question, Colleen. So I think I mentioned this briefly when we started talking. I do entry and exit interviews for every employee that comes to our organization, right? And it's a chance to get to know everyone. We're still small enough to do that. We're growing. I'm going to keep doing it for as long as we can, but then hopefully it will find a mechanism to ensure that it continues to happen. And we talk about kind of two things that for us, right, represent the way that we want people to feel they're empowered to behave. And it's really about, how do you feel empowered in your job? Like, how do you view the people around you? And I think I mentioned this briefly earlier. We're a virtual organization, so we don't have a physical office to go to. So we do everything via Zoom, Slack, chat messages, video calls. We have an annual meeting. But it really requires a connection between everyone to do that. So we talk about two things in every entry interview. We talk about information security, and we work in the personal healthcare space, right? We work with PHI patients, and our customers are providers and provider systems. And we all know just from listening to the news any day that cybersecurity is just a massive problem and continuing.
Yeah.
So we've asked everyone to think about security, right? And being cognizant of not rushing into things. So think carefully, right, about the information that you're receiving and why someone's asking you to do something, whatever that may be. And it's actually central. All the cybersecurity tools that we have, which we have lots of them, actually sit around this central idea of being very intentional about the things that you do and understanding what they are. And so that to me is a real cultural piece to our company, which is like, what are you doing right now? Why are you doing about? Think about what you're doing and why you're doing.
Yeah.
That's number one. The other thing I talk to everyone about, and I think this is really important to me, is, and it may be silly the way that it comes out, but I'll go for it anyway, which is, this is not a company where you get in trouble for doing things. This is a company where you get in trouble from not doing things. And what do we mean for that? Is like, if you become aware of something, right? If you're thinking about something, you think it's a problem, do something about it. And that could mean take care of the problem yourself, right? Or get your colleagues to help you or ask for advice, but take action, right? And don't assume that there is going to be somebody else or that the problem can continue to exist as it is. Now, we may prioritize problems. You may have to ask someone to say, like, okay, we're aware of this issue. We're not going to be able to fix it now.
Right.
We have resources to do it, but let's put it on the list and then we can balance that against it or go out and take that. And the reason that that's so important to me personally, and I think now culturally across this organization, is that's how you get things done well, quickly, right? Is when everybody collaborates together and tries to take care of it. And so to me, those kind of two things of like intentionality and thoughtfulness coupled with almost personal responsibility and a requirement, right, that we all take action about the things that are going are just crucial. And that's why people are successful in the organization or not, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I appreciate that. And it actually leads me to kind of a close where, which is actually the very essence of everything we talked about, or the point of view that I've expressed, is that humility is at the core. Mm-hmm. And I learned that firsthand when I was at Boeing. The leadership team at that time was incredibly arrogant, incredible hubris. Things are changing there now from what I can tell, and I really hope. But humility is at the core of the model that I talked about, because a leader who is humble understands that it's not their values, it's everyone else's values. And then the second thing is, when someone is in a situation, which happens multiple times a day, instead of saying, oh, I got this, or nobody's going to notice, that people their personal value, their name is on the line. And that translates into how you affect patients in the marketplace. So that humility is absolutely essential, because humility, talk about being a contrarian or provocative, humility is going to raise your share price. Humility is going to increase your retention of your employees and your customers. So I think starting out with humility, and that, I looked at several of your interviews before doing this, and that's part of who you are, because you've asked the question of someone, how do you know what you don't know? So that's number one. I don't know this. And how do I, number two was, how do I know when I'm wrong? So when you start with that critical thinking that is embedded in humility, you're not anchored with the concrete shoes of, oh, we got this, and that's not going to happen to us. It will. So what do you do? So anyhow, that's it.
Wonderful, Colleen. First of all, thank you for coming on the show. This has been a wonderful conversation. It's been so great to spend some time with you. Looking forward to keeping in touch and continuing this discussion.
Same here. Thank you.